Our speaker tonight, Reverend Tim Costello, is, according to one of his sons, an enthusiastic name dropper. And according to his wife, an extreme extrovert. Now, thankfully for us, these two attributes combine to create one exceptional storyteller. It is all but guaranteed that we will be moved and enlightened by Tim's presentation tonight. Would everyone now please join me in welcoming the Reverend Tim Costello.
I'd like to acknowledge the Bedegal people, their ancestors and their custodians on whose land we are tonight. Thank you, Vice-Chancellor, for that introduction. It's pretty much as I wrote it, except the last comments. And thank you very much for a Gandhi summary and coming with your passion. I think we're all very touched with that. Thank you, High Commissioner. For most of his extraordinary life, Albert Einstein hung portraits on his wall of two scientists, Isaac Newton and James Maxwell. They were the role models to inspire him. Then, near the end of his life, Einstein replaced them with a portrait of Mahatma Gandhi. Einstein said he realised he needed role models, not of success, but of humility. He called Gandhi one of the greatest moral leaders of all time. Einstein wrote, "I believe that Gandhi's views were the most enlightened of all the political men of our time." Well, enlightened and humble, but also a brilliant strategist. He believed in the power of right over might, and he negotiated a very principled path in very difficult political times. A path that marks him out as a great revolutionary, but as one whose revolutions were peaceful. Most revolutions end up devouring their own children. Gandhi is different. He fought injustice by practicing justice. He fought against violence non-violently. He opposed discrimination by embracing the oppressed. His ideals of non-violence and universal humanity still inform and inspire. Einstein was particularly impressed by Gandhi's concept of, and it's a Hindi word which I may pronounce wrongly, satyagraha, which roughly translates as devotion to the truth. Gandhi said all our activities should be centred in truth. Truth should be the very breath of our life. He said truth would always conquer untruth. So Gandhi believed that the performance of one's duty should be utterly independent of public opinion, based on a sense of truth. It's rather refreshing, isn't it, in this era of post-truth 21st century fake news? Rather refreshing when most of our political leaders seem to prefer stoking irrational fears to hold on to power. Gandhi just asserted, "Find the ground on which you plant your feet, the ground of truth. Hold that ground." Well, whatever Gandhi taught and believed, Gandhi's image has been hijacked as a brand these days. Apple used Gandhi's image in its Think Different campaign. Ironically, the man who was known for his simple living is now used to promote the sale of Apple's most expensive computers. Gandhi's image was used recently to flog a limited edition $25,000 Mont Blanc fountain pen. His sandals, spectacles, pocket watch, spinning wheel letters, even a bottle containing some of the soil where he fell when shot 71 years ago, have all gone up for auction. Gandhi, who spoke out about the obsession with possessions, I'm sure would be horrified by this. T-shirts with Gandhi's image, often with the quirky millennial slogans such as "Peace, bro," have reinvented the Mahatma to attract young customers. One major T-shirt maker announced that the new Gandhi brand portrayed him as a superhero because youngsters do not believe in heroes. Youngsters want superheroes. Well, Gandhi was not a superhero. His faddish behaviour, claims that he did not do enough to dismantle India's caste system, accusations by some that he was a tool of capitalists, claims that he worked with the British colonial government to promote racial segregation in South Africa are still spoken of by his critics. Gandhi was human. But a couple of months, late last year, Prime Minister Scott Morrison gleefully compared Australia to a popular spice mix at the unveiling of a Mahatma Gandhi statue in the heart of Sydney's Indian community. But a couple of months earlier, the Indian community in Melbourne, in the suburb of Dandenong in Melbourne, even rejected a proposal to set up a life-size bronze statue of Gandhi. In other words, there are very diverse 21st century views on the man. But tonight we honour the fact that's undeniable. Gandhi was one of history's momentous figures. 71 years after his assassination, his global influence is enormous. How relevant is Gandhi's philosophy today in the post-truth 21st century? I think brilliantly relevant. He addressed fundamental issues: poverty and hunger, violence, war and injustice, the very issues we are struggling with the very mixed benefits of globalisation, with the retribalisation going on around the world of turning inwards, the marginalisation of minorities, the rise of divisive populist politics. Incredibly relevant are Gandhi's 7 deadly social sins that lead, he said, to disconnection and violence: wealth without work, pleasure without conscience, science without humanity, knowledge without character, politics without principle. Noticed a bit of that? And what could have been really the headline after the Royal Commission findings: commerce without morality. He added, worship also without sacrifice. These social sins flourish today as much as in Gandhi's time. Gandhi envisioned a world where justice is done unto the last, and in which all institutions aim to get the best out of humankind. He recognised that political and social liberty must go hand in hand with economic progress. He said economic growth has to be equitable and fair. He said genuine democracy in the West was clearly an impossibility as long as the wide gulf between the rich and hungry millions persisted. He said legislators, politicians, often acted like prostitutes, his infamous term for the British Parliament. And he said voters too often take their cue from newspapers, which are also often dishonest. I'd hate him to see the interview with the CEO of Cambridge Analytica today. We just make up facts, he said. We just micro-target people driven by emotions of either fear or hope. Don't worry about the facts. We know them better than they know themselves because we've bought their Facebook likes and dislikes. We know them better than their spouses. We will just target messages. Gandhi said politics encircle us today like the coil of a snake from which we cannot get out, no matter how much one tries. He once said, I wish, therefore, to wrestle with the snake. So many decades before the technological revolutions of iPads and search engines, Facebook and Twitter, Gandhi warned, people might learn to fly like birds and swim like fish, but it would be of little use and even a disaster if they forgot how to walk like human beings. He warned very presciently about the pollution and destruction of nature. He said, what we are doing to the forests of the world is but a mirror reflection of what we are doing to ourselves and to one another. his principle of sustainability: more from less, for more others. Gandhi's ashrams in South Africa and India were experiments in simple living, prototypes to the concept of small is beautiful, emphasising the small, the local, the human, simplicity and self-awareness. He realised that human beings are basically religious animals. He said, we search for some sort of authenticity we can trust in, something beyond the ordinary to cling to. Gandhi thought religion was an ethical and moral mooring to all our actions, necessary for the formation of just societies. But he predicted the rise in religious fundamentalism that preys on prejudices and fears. I think one of his most powerful writings, decades ago he wrote, powerful for today: what is gained through fear lasts only while the fear lasts. Politicians who stoke our fears. He said people should know life was a blessed spiritual journey to be shared with others rather than something to be feared and endured. And he talks about an inner voice guiding him, leading him to his decision when he took the 385-kilometre salt march to Dundee. That march inspired and informed so many later campaigns of non-violent resistance. Martin Luther King Jr. in the 50s and 60s was the embodiment of that non-violent protest, a mandate to seek a better world. King wrote, as I delved deeper into the philosophy of Gandhi, my scepticism concerning the power of love gradually diminished, and I came to see for the first time its potency in the area of social reform. Gandhi realised the power of non-violent authenticity when he inspired Indian people to take to their spinning wheels in their fight for the independence from the British. Indian cloth, created on little spinning wheels from Calcutta to Delhi, was an economic necessity, a religious ritual, and it became a national symbol. It was a living work of art that energised the Indian people. This was not art for the sake of riches, ego or fame, but for creativity, expressing the divinity within all of us and our ability to shape the universe for better. Here's Gandhi emphasising connectedness, openness, transparency, sharing of knowledge, cross-pollination of thoughts and ideas. Former High Court Justice Michael Kirby, who delivered this oration in 2013, says in his book, What Would Gandhi Do?, that the life of the Mahatma continues to challenge us and Australians. We can learn so much from the father of India on women's rights, animal rights, climate change and sexuality. Kirby said Gandhi was fallible, paradoxical, annoying, sometimes inconsistent, often puzzling, as all human beings are. But he acknowledged that Gandhi's ethical principles carried lessons concerning desirable limits of growth, the need for greater simplicity, for self-discipline by human beings, the necessity to view all living things as entitled to human respect. Globalisation in our world. Gandhi was not against globalisation, but he did believe it could lead to environmental hazards and hyper-consumerism. I think he's been proved right. Theoretically, globalisation should open possibilities of development to all countries of the world. Globalism has positive and negative outcomes, as does some development, but what we've seen is richer nations under globalisation getting richer and too many poorer nations remaining poor. Globalisation continues to challenge social justice. As we turn inwards with those ill winds blowing, the old gods of blood and soil, blood leading to racism, soil to nationalism, tearing up international rules and treaties, we start to look away from the well-being of 7.4 billion brothers and sisters on the planet. The more economically impoverished a nation remains, the more social injustice thrives. The greater the poverty, the fewer people are given fair and equal access to basic needs and rights. The world has more than enough to feed the hungry, but as Gandhi said, not enough for the world's greed. We know 1/3 of all food produced globally, 1.3 billion tonnes a year, gets lost or goes to waste. That's enough itself, the waste, to feed all the world's hungry 4 times over. According to the UN, providing electricity to the 1.4 billion people who currently have none would raise global emissions by just 1%. We have to address climate change. I'm just back from South Sudan and Uganda. The droughts are longer, the poverty is more entrenched, but you're also struck with people who don't have access to power, the fundamental thing that we depend on. World Vision is at the forefront of dealing with reforestation and solar energy. Socially, we believe we can't ignore these people. We can't leave this many people behind. It's got to be about people, not property or profits. Questions of justice always puzzle us. For me, from an early age, my question was this: why do some people in our world get more than they need and some people miss out? Is the architecture that has determined this given? Is it sacred? Is it natural? Or is poverty created? If it's natural, it's very hard to challenge it. If it's created by the rules we've set, we need to change the rules. From my faith, we are all made in the image of God. We are all children of God. Why then are my children, born here in Australia, enjoying opportunities, options and choices than children born in Asia and Africa? Why do so many white Australians have opportunities still eluding many of our Indigenous brothers and sisters? Why can't we challenge the great lottery of life, where some won first ticket and others drew last ticket? None of us choose the stage of life onto which we are thrown. Why is this lottery so arbitrary? Well, if injustice was merely a matter of evil people somewhere committing evil deeds, we could draw up a list and take them out. But it's a bit more complex. The truth is, the dividing line between good and evil cuts through the heart of all of us. The cause of injustice at its heart is apathy. Apathy because either we're unaware of suffering, or because it seems too enormous and we feel helpless, or because we don't care. Injustice is perpetrated through ignorance and misunderstanding. It's why I love Gandhi. He talked of loving people into transformation and of a need for a radical conversion of the comparatively wealthy. Martin Luther King picked up his idea of love and applied it in the public sphere. Love is usually either romantic or interpersonal. Martin Luther King famously said, "We will match your capacity to hate us with our capacity to love you." Well, he's picking up Gandhi. Loving people into transformation. Loving them into a radical conversion of those, all of us here tonight, who are comparatively wealthy. He said our complacency can turn into indifference, and our indifference then turns into neglect. He argued it was not caring that was the real problem in this world. Becoming hardened or numbed to the world's problems and needs and prospects. That starts in my heart. That starts in your heart. He wrote, "What difference does it make to the dead, the orphans and the homeless, whether the mad destruction is wrought under the name of totalitarianism or the holy name of liberty or democracy. He said we win justice quickest by rendering justice to the other party. We care enough to do justice. Social justice is a very difficult term to name. Everyone's in favour of it, but none of us are quite sure what it's about. It's very contestable. We're much clearer about retributive justice. I was a criminal lawyer for a long time. Every crim I defended repented on the steps of the court. They were never going back to crime. They always did. Not always, most did. We're clearer about restorative justice, WIC, Mabo, some of those restorative acts. Civil justice. Social justice is a fuzzy concept. It doesn't have a body of jurisprudence. It lacks case law. Politically, it's a tricky term. Some on the left say it's equality of outcomes. Those on the right say it's equality of opportunities. Then we start debating the role of the state, the market, and individuals to achieve a socially just society. To tabloid media, justice means harsher punishment, focused on strong retribution and deterrence. Lawyers say, well, it's the application of the rule of law, justice, and you can't really define it beyond that. Philosophers say justice is about morality. Plato wrote in the Republic, justice is not mere strength, it is a harmonious strength. Justice is not the right of the stronger, but the effective harmony of the whole. Social justice, I think, resonates a little bit with what Plato was saying, that it has to have a redistributive angle. It actually has to say, what is the common good? Unlike an election in May, when parties will try and put together a patchwork of enough vested interests to get them a majority, how do they pitch for the common good? For what is the benefit of this nation, not just my hip pocket or my vested interest. That's a harmonious strength of the whole. Social justice too often depends on the spectacles you've got on and how you see your own self-interest. We know social justice should be colourblind, racially blind, gender blind, and yet we know public policy still fails to deliver social justice to minority groups. Obviously Indigenous, obviously the homeless, who in my city, Melbourne, and I'm sure it's the case here, are so visible on the streets. And when you ask why, Australia, well, my state, let me talk about Victoria, has only spent something like 2% of all housing stock on social housing, public and community housing. Scandinavians have 20% of all housing stock, that's social. A fight between federal and state governments over who pays. The buck shifting is why we've got so many homeless on the street. But somehow the homeless don't quite enter into our calculations come an election. Of course, it includes Indigenous, the deprived and the disabled, where public policy fails. The dictionary says justice is a distribution of wealth, of opportunities, of privileges within a society. Properly argued, the Income Tax Assessment Act probably is the main legislative instrument of social justice. There, from those who have more, paying more, and yet we often have moves always for lower tax, lower corporate tax. Banks missed out on their big tax break. I don't think they're going to get one now after yesterday's news. Well, it's not just distribution of wealth. Social justice is about having equal rights to basic liberties and needs, about feeling you can live in a just society that is committed to challenging injustice and values diversity. Really, it's about sharing a common humanity, about fairness. Fairness is always argued. I remember being at a birthday party with my son, And after the candles were blown out, Mum started cutting up the cake. And an American mother was there. And she said, "Oh, what are you doing?" The Australian mum said, "Oh, we cut up the cake. We give each child a piece. And that's our practice." I remember hearing the American mum saying, "Is that fair?" And the Australian mum said, "Yes, every child's getting a piece, and it's the same size piece." "What do you mean, is that fair?" And the American mum said, "Well, you haven't asked the kids if they all want a piece and what size piece they want." Now, she does have a point. In our development work in World Vision, we can't just decide for communities what they need. They need to have agency. They need to decide. The importance of having a say is there. But it was interesting to me, from an egalitarian Australian view to a different view of fairness. This is why we struggle with what is fair in the world. We come with particular lenses through which we see life. Well, the wealthy and powerful have kept the masses often in a subordinate position, especially in developing nations. The rules that we have written aren't fair. So the message of justice needs to be proclaimed. With the rise of micro-tribes, once defined by nation, religion, culture, we're now seeing sometimes those rules only cemented in by those who are wealthy and powerful. We know of digital communities that have become echo chambers just of their own prejudices. We know of alternative facts pre-packaged where fears and hopes are targeted, those emotions. We know our perceptions of right and wrong, fair and unfair, are often being intensified without a broad mainstreaming of listening to difference. The American mother asking a question, which is a strand of justice. We all know that it's getting harder. Gandhi believed in the power of small communities to overcome poverty and injustice. In our work, we have been inspired at World Vision by Gandhi, by community-led development as an effective model for change. We know poverty is not just a low income, it's lack of dignity. It's a sense of humiliation. It's the sense that I am God-forsaken because of my caste, or my gender, or my disability. I am God-forsaken. I did something wrong in a last life. My karma means I'm now in this caste, or this body, or this gender. Solves the problem of why I'm suffering. You must have done something wrong in a past life. Social fatedness in this life. We believe in World Vision that every person carries the image of God. Whatever their gender, whatever their caste, whatever their tribe, whatever their power or lack of it, they deserve access to services, to equality, opportunity, health, education, and civic participation. This is absolutely true in the closing the gap between Indigenous and non-Indigenous Australians. Recent Closing the Gap reports show that the supply-driven service delivery models of the past are not working to address the gaps in health, education and outcome for our Aboriginal and Torres Strait Island people. We are also in this space trying to support community-led development, whether it's across the world or here in Indigenous communities. People choosing the good as they name it, not as we name it. Well, we have challenges ahead, but Gandhi teaches us that ordinary people can change the course of history. We have challenges when we start to think about how our politics works. We have challenges on fundamental principles. In a book, Justice, Thomas Patrick Burke wrote, "The concept of justice depends on being treated as one deserves." I think Dr. Martin Luther King 5 decades ago put it really well. He said, "I am convinced that if we are to get on the right side of the world revolution, we must undergo a radical revolution of values. We must rapidly begin the shift from a thing-oriented society to a person-oriented society. When machines, computers, profit motives, property rights are considered more important than people, the giant triplets of racism, materialism, and militarism are incapable of being conquered," Martin Luther King said. "A true revolution of values will soon cause us to question the fairness and justice of many of our past and present policies." I like the fact that when Martin Luther King was assassinated, he was down there in Memphis marching for white trash or garbage workers. His own black civil rights people said, "Not our fight. And these white people are rednecks and they're racists." And Martin Luther King said, "Yep, you're probably right. But they're poor. They're oppressed." Here was an application of love in the public sphere, of bridging across that gap, of being person-oriented. Well, for us in Australia and in our world, we still are struggling with justice. There's 1.1 billion of us who are overweight. We're trying to get thinner. And nearly the same number who are undernourished, looking for a decent meal. We still have 730,000 Australian children, almost 1 in 5, who are now living in Australia below the poverty line. At a time when Australia has been marked by Credit Suisse as the first nation in the world, highest nation on their index in per capita wealth. 730,000 Australian children still living below the poverty line. This is, in my view, the great challenge that should be in the election debates. We know that many people living in poverty in war zones, and I've just come back from South Sudan, in detention and slavery, are suffering. Girls still being forced to marry at the age of 12 or younger. Can injustice be solved? Well, I believe so. In time of unparalleled prosperity, beset by political, social and environmental challenges, we have to keep hope alive. We have to nourish hope within ourselves and start to live out what Gandhi said, that radical conversion. We know a lot about extreme poverty. It's complex, but we understand it. We also understand the solutions. It's a question of having the will. Lest you feel depressed, let me say that we are making great progress too. When I started at World Vision 15 years ago now, I would say my melancholy duty is to say 30,000 kids under the age of 5 will die today from preventable disease and dirty water and not having enough calories to get through the day. What I call stupid poverty, because we know how to treat disease, we know how to provide clean water, we know there's enough food. Today, 15 years on, it won't be 30,000 kids that die under the age of 5 from those causes. It will be 17,000 kids. We are making progress. We put poverty into the Millennium Development Goals. First time poverty was put in a human rights framework and had a global plan to deal with it. Now we have the Sustainable Development Goals that aims to end extreme poverty by 2030. For us, we still remain hopeful. One of the things I'm critical about is our federal government's attitude to the world's poor. Most other nations have a piece of legislation that says we lock in our giving in overseas aid. In Australia, we don't. That means our politicians can use the aid budget like an ATM, simply to withdraw and top up their debts. Tony Abbott and Joe Hockey slashed aid in their first budget by $11 billion over 4 years. It cost lives. It denied girls education. It smashed hopes. It appealed because they said, we're just going to look after ourselves. This was devastating because our aid is now at the lowest level ever in our history, 0.22% of gross national income. 22 cents in $100 of gross national income. The Brits have legislated it at 0.7%. A Conservative Prime Minister, David Cameron, when under pressure to cut aid, Cameron said, I won't balance the books on the backs of the poor. Britain's debt and deficit is much higher than Australia's, by the way. Scandinavian, Dutch, so many other countries have legislated it at 0.7%. We're at 0.22%, our lowest ever. This is profound failure, giving ourselves a leave pass when we are one of the wealthiest nations on earth. A peer review released by the OECD showed that Australia, just in the last year, in aid giving fell another 2 places to 19th, our lowest ranking ever. Way behind New Zealand, Britain, Canada, Denmark, Iceland, the list goes on and on. How did we become so mean? When did we become so mean? We are not shouldering our fair share of the development and humanitarian load that is making poverty history, from 30,000 deaths under 5 a day to 17,000. Aid advances gender equality. It helps people break out of the poverty cycle. From where I've just come from in East Africa, it keeps people from starvation and death. Well, it's morally right in a humanitarian sense, and it is fundamentally in our interests. The world is a waterbed. When you press down here, it comes up here. We don't deal with 65 million displaced people. They get on boats. We don't give them hope. They get on boats and go to Europe and change the geopolitics, because aid in the Lebanese and Jordanian camps where World Vision works had been cut from $30 a month for those refugees to $13.50. The exact result was so many more got on boats and fled. Aid is a waterbed. Here is Australia stepping out of its responsibilities. Well, if a country like Australia won't lead, who will? I think we have to raise our voices. We have to look into our hearts as Gandhi invites us to do. We have to start to think about countries that are taking climate change and the environment seriously and say, already the poorest, most vulnerable people are being assaulted and devastated by climate change. They are on the most degraded land with the least resources. The impact is terrible already. And we know where this story ends in terms of it impacting future generations of Australians. I want to conclude by saying that for all of us, this is personal because it's about our commitment to simplicity, to caring, to keeping hope alive. In Gandhi, we find a source of optimism. He believed that the world can change for the better. I'm with him. He believed that every one of us has to be part of the solution. I'm with him. We all have a voice. We all have gifts, privileges, and talents to make a difference. Gandhi's call was to self-sacrifice over self-interest, to individual obligations over individual rights, to renunciation over consumption, to self-sacrifice and non-violence over violence. I, for one, believe whatever purposes war achieved, it now has outlived all its uses. War never achieves what we think it achieves. Can you beat violence with more violence? I'm shocked that our government, Christopher Pyne, has a credit facility for Australian arms exporters to get us into the top 10 of the world's arms exporters, a credit facility equal to our aid budget. That is wrong. War has outlived its purposes. To quote Gandhi, he said, "In a gentle way, you can shake the world with the power of your beliefs, with the power of your conviction, with your devotion to the invincible truth." Love and truth, he said, are faces of the same coin, both very difficult to practice, but the only things worth living for. Let's pick up the baton, live with hope, choose hope. Then anything's possible. Thank you.